this might sound crazy, but believe that Bigfoot not only exists, but understands gratitude. In the remote wilderness of Olympic Peninsula, a reclusive old man once risked his life to save a drowning Bigfoot family. Days later, when a violent creature attacked his cabin, those same beings returned to protect him. Contrary to the myth of Bigfoot as a mindless beast, the truth few know is this: they have families, rules, and honor debts. Harlan Pike thought he was saving a life, but instead, he awakened a sacred bond between man and nature. This isn't folklore. It comes from the handwritten accounts of Harlan, who lived over 30 years alone by a river, surrounded by nothing but trees, snow, and secrets too sacred for the internet. Watch to the end, and you'll uncover the chilling way Bigfoot shows gratitude. A near-death encounter that redefined survival. A quiet philosophy that could reshape how you view kindness. When Boone, his old dog, was badly injured and the cabin under siege, 3 giant silhouettes emerged from the fog. They didn't speak, but they stood their ground, growled back, and drove the predator away. No one believed it, until they saw the giant footprints left behind. Skip this video, and you'll miss why one small act of kindness changed a broken man's life forever, and what a silent nod from a forest creature really meant. The river had grown restless. Even before dawn, Harlan Pike could hear it groaning beneath the melt. Not in a way most folks would ever notice. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks, but in the quiet language of a man who'd lived too long beside something bigger than himself. The cabin creaked against the cold. Boone, the old mutt, stirred by the hearth but didn't rise. It was late spring, yet the morning still carried a bite. The kind of air that stung the lungs but reminded you that you were still here. He pulled on the canvas coat he'd patched last winter, the one with the elbow tear that Evelyn used to tease him about, back when she was alive and the world still had laughter inside it. He paused just a second too long at the door frame, hand resting against the splintered wood, looking out past the mist curling through the trees. There was nothing but fog and the churn of the Hoh River below. A trap line ran north along the slope, where the runoff hadn't flooded the trail yet. He took it slow, boots pressing into the mud, pack slung across his shoulder, rifle over the other. Boone followed at a limp, old hips clicking with each step, loyal without needing a word. Most days out here, nothing happened. The trap stayed empty. The same trees stood where they'd always stood. The world carried on without notice. But that day, the wind shifted. Harlan paused. There, beneath the whistle of branches and snowmelt, came something else. A noise he hadn't heard in years. Not an animal call, not thunder. Something urgent, guttural, drenched in panic. He moved toward the riverbank, weaving between the thick pines, boots sloshing through the wet underbrush. The sound grew louder, throaty gasps, splashes, not like deer or elk, but bigger, much bigger. Then he saw it. 3 dark figures thrashed in the middle of the flooded river. The water was fast, chewing up fallen logs and broken ice. One of them, massive, hair-soaked black and slicked down, stood nearly upright in the torrent, feet braced against the current, arms locked around something small and limp slumped across its shoulder. Another figure, slightly smaller, clawed at the icy flow, slipping under and bursting up again. The current tugged at them both like a hungry thing, and in the middle, dangling, unmoving, was a youngling, drenched fur plastered to thin limbs. A face buried in the shoulder of the towering male. No motion, no cry, just the slow drag of the river trying to take them all under. Harlan didn't think. He tore the rifle strap from his shoulder and let it drop into the mud. The pack came next. Boone barked once, sharp and anxious, but Harlan was already lunging down the embankment. He unhooked the coil of rope from his belt, eyes locked on the giant in the current. "Hold, goddammit, hold on!" he shouted, not even knowing if they understood anything but fear. The big one's eyes met his just as it stumbled. A flicker of something passed between them. Desperation. Not animal instinct, something deeper. familiar. Harlan stepped into the river. The cold hit like a punch. He nearly lost his footing instantly. The meltwater was brutal, clawing at his legs, biting through the canvas, the denim, the skin. But he kept going. One step, another. The rope bit his palms as he whipped it into a lasso, hands shaking violently. He let it fly. The loop caught, around the upper chest of the towering figure. The second he yanked, he felt the raw weight of it, the resistance not just of muscle, but of the river itself. His knees buckled in the mud. Ice chunks slammed into his shins, but he braced his back against a rock and dug in. "Come on, come on," he grunted, teeth chattering so hard they ached. The creature didn't fight the pull. It stumbled forward, one leg, then another. He could see the child now, its limbs limp, head bobbing as the father, was that what he was? Shielded it from the debris. Behind, the mother vanished under again, then resurfaced, clawing toward the rope like it was salvation itself. With one final pull, the big one crashed onto the gravel bar. Harlan fell backward from the force, arms burning. The female washed up seconds later, crawling to her knees, gasping, retching. The youngling slid from the father's shoulder onto the rocks. Still no movement. Harlan dragged himself upright. His hands were numb, legs cut, ears ringing. But he moved closer. The small body lay curled on its side, soaked to the skin, hair matted with ice and silt. Then a cough. Weak, rattling, but it was a breath. The child convulsed and spat up water. Then another breath. Shallow, trembling, but there. Harlan dropped to his knees beside it, still 10 feet away, unsure what to do. The parents loomed, panting, dripping, but didn't come closer. They stared. He stared back. None of them moved, just the sound of the river raging on behind them. Boone barked faintly from the ridge above, but it sounded miles away. Harlan's lips trembled, not just from the cold. He looked down at his hands, the rope burns, the cuts, the shivers. Then looked back at the beings before him. The mother gathered the child gently into her arms. The father's gaze locked onto Harlan once more. Deep-set eyes, wet fur, broad chest rising and falling like a bellows. He didn't growl, didn't roar. He simply looked, not like an animal, not like a man either, but like something ancient, something that had decided not to let him drown in his own past. Then, silently, they turned. One step, then another. No rustle, no sound. Into the trees. Harlan knelt alone on the gravel. Mud on his knees. Chest heaving. Rope clutched in his frozen fingers. The sky cracked open with light above the trees. The first rays of morning sun catching the mist that hovered above the current. They were gone. Vanished into the forest like ghosts, like memory. And all that remained was the silence and the sound of the river, still carrying the weight of everything it couldn't take. The river had gone quiet. Not silent, but quieter, like something had passed through it and taken the violence with it. Harlan stood alone at the edge of the gravel bar, boots soaked, knees caked in mud, breath rising in ragged clouds. His fingers were still raw from the rope. Boone barked again from up the trail, but it felt distant, almost unreal. Everything else had vanished. The roar, the struggle, the pounding of his own heart. And now, nothing. Just the retreating mist and the wet prints left behind by something that shouldn't have existed. He stayed there, motionless. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe 10 minutes. Time folded in on itself the way it does when you've brushed too close to something otherworldly. He turned to gather his pack, but then something made him stop. A shift. Not in the trees, not in the wind. Behind him. He turned. They hadn't gone far. The father stood in the tree line, massive and dark, steam rising off his fur like smoke from a dying fire. The mother stood a few steps behind, one hand on the child's shoulder, the other shielding its head, protective without being afraid. The child, it was watching him now. Not hiding, just watching, eyes wide, wet fur clinging to its body, shivering slightly but upright. And the father took a step forward. Not a charge, not a threat, just a step. Harlan's pulse stuttered. His feet locked in place. The air felt heavier somehow, like a thick velvet curtain had just dropped between him and the rest of the world. Every bird had gone silent. The river still moved, but now it was background, like the volume had been turned down on the rest of nature so that this moment, this one impossible moment, could be heard more clearly. Another step. He could see the water still dripping from the long strands of the creature's arm, could hear the slow pull of its breath, deep and guttural. Its chest rose and fell with control, not exertion. The eyes found him again. Not like they had during the rescue. Those had been frantic, desperate. These were deliberate, measured, ancient. They stood 10 feet apart. The breeze picked up. Sunlight broke through the fir trees behind them, low and golden, casting long streaks of light across the wet earth. The steam curling off the creature's body turned amber. For a breathless second, it looked like a statue, a monument, something carved into time and left here long before people came. Then the creature did something Harlan couldn't quite understand. It didn't speak, but it didn't have to. It nodded, just once, a slow, deliberate tilt of the chin downward. Not theatrical, not human, but undeniably intentional. And Harlan felt it in his bones, like a church bell rung just below hearing. A recognition, an acknowledgement, not of power or threat, but of action, of choice. His breath caught in his chest. He wanted to say something, anything, but there was no language here, not one he could use. So he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just met the gaze and let it settle. Let it tell him what it needed to tell. The creature blinked, turned, and vanished into the trees. No cracking branches, no rustle of undergrowth, just gone. The mother followed, then the child. A flicker of movement. The child glanced back at him for a second, quick, curious, but said nothing. Then it too was gone, and that was that. No trumpets, no legends, no final roar, just mist, sun, and silence. Boone came padding down the slope behind him finally, sniffing cautiously at the air, tail low, ears back. He let out a low whine, and Harlan instinctively put a hand on the dog's head, grounding them both. They walked back to the cabin slow. No one spoke. Not that there was anyone to speak to. The birds had started singing again. A pair of squirrels darted across the trail like nothing had happened. The forest returned to its rhythm, like a curtain had closed and the play was over. But Harlan's chest was different. Not lighter, not heavier, just changed. At the ridge, he paused to look back. The river glimmered below like a wound healing under sunlight. There was no trace of what had happened. No fur, no tracks, not even the rope. Just water and wind. Back at the cabin, the door creaked open the way it always had. The same old hinges. Same soft groan of wood settling into itself. Boone curled near the hearth. Harlan knelt by the wood stove, added a log, stirred the coals, then sat back on his heels. The flames licked upward, casting flickering light against the old stone. He stared into the fire, but all he saw was those eyes. That look, that impossible, quiet understanding. He thought about Evelyn for the first time in weeks. Really thought about her. Not just the memory, not just the absence. The way she used to hum while making coffee. The way she whispered to their daughter when she thought he wasn't listening. The way she'd always believed in things that couldn't be explained. "You'd believe me," he muttered, voice hoarse from cold and river water. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, and inside, something old and aching shifted slightly in his chest. Not gone, not healed, but stirred. Like a hand reaching out from under a frozen river, not to pull someone under, but to be held. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat near the fire until it burned low, eyes half closed, mind spinning slowly. Boone snored softly. The moon rose and cast long silver slashes across the wooden floor. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. But nothing else came. No more sounds, no more visits. Still, he kept listening. He would listen for the rest of his life. And even if they never came back, he knew the forest had changed. Because something in him had changed first. And change always leaves a mark. By midday, the sky turned a dull pewter gray, the kind of color that made shadows stretch wrong and pine needles whisper secrets. Harlan had been on the trail longer than planned. The river had calmed, but the memory of what he'd seen hadn't. His legs moved from habit, boots pressing into the moss like they had 1,000 times before, but his mind was tangled somewhere in that gravel bar. He couldn't shake the image of the child's breath sputtering back to life, or that gaze, the father's silent nod. Something had shifted inside him. Still, the forest had a rhythm, and he fell into it again like an old song, almost believing nothing had changed. Almost. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder, gave a sharp whistle, and Boone came trotting up behind him from the brush. The dog was quieter than usual. Normally, he'd dart ahead, nose in the air, ears twitching. But today, he stayed close, eyes scanning the woods, tail down. They were both listening for something neither of them could name. The woods weren't silent, but they weren't quite alive either. No birds, no distant chittering. Not even the wind dared cut through the canopy. Just the faint drip of thawed snow from the fir needles, one drop at a time, like a faucet left on in an empty house. They crested the final hill, and the cabin came into view, tucked back between two leaning cedars like a secret you don't say out loud. Nothing looked wrong at first glance. Smoke curled faint from the chimney. The stack of split wood was still there by the wall, but then he stopped. The front door was cracked open, not wide, just enough. Like someone had started to walk in, then changed their mind. Harlan's stomach tightened. He knew damn well he'd locked it that morning. He always did, out of habit more than fear. No one ever came this far up. Not anymore. He raised a hand slightly, signaling Boone to stay. The dog froze, nose twitching. Harlan stepped forward slowly, each bootfall deliberate, soft. He shifted the pack off his shoulder and let it drop into the grass without a sound. His other hand dropped to the handle of the revolver at his hip. It felt wrong already, pulling a weapon on a home you built with your bare hands. But wrong was everywhere now. And it didn't care for comfort. Closer now, he saw something else. A single muddy print, half smeared across the wooden porch. No tread, no heel, just 5 thick, wide-set toes. Bigger than any man's boot, twice as wide. Heavy, pressed deep like whatever left it had the weight of a truck but moved like smoke. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The hearth had gone dark. Embers barely glowed. The scent of pine smoke had faded, replaced by something damp, earthy, feral, like wet moss clinging to old bone. He stepped through slowly, eyes darting across the space. The table had been nudged out of place. One leg of the chair was snapped clean through. A ceramic mug lay in pieces near the stove, shattered across the floor. Nothing was taken. No food missing. No money touched. Not that he kept much. But everything felt off. Touched, judged. Not like a thief looking for something. More like something trying to understand what this place meant. And then Boone whined from the bedroom. Harlan moved fast, crossing the cabin in 3 strides and yanking the curtain aside. Boone was crouched low beneath the bed, tail tucked, ears pinned back. A smear of red darkened the fur on his side. Just a scratch, shallow but fresh. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just stared past Harlan with wide, glassy eyes, as if expecting the thing to still be there. Harlan dropped to one knee, pulled Boone gently out, checked the wound. It was clean. No tearing. More like he'd been brushed. Nudged aside. But by what? He stood and turned back to the main room. That's when he saw the trail. Faint, but visible. starting from the broken chair and moving toward the back door. Large wet prints smeared into the wood, each one darker in the center, where the foot struck hardest. They stopped just at the edge of the back threshold. The door was closed, but not locked. He stepped over slowly, unlatching the bolt. Pushed it open. A gust of forest air swept in, thick with cedar and wet bark. It chilled his skin in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but he knew what had been there, and the more he stood in that doorway, the more certain he became that this hadn't been the family from before. These tracks were broader, the stride longer, the weight deeper. There was no softness in how it had walked, no hesitation. It had entered the cabin, not to say thank you, but to understand something, and then it had left, maybe. He locked both doors, all the windows, stoked the fire until the flames reached high again, licking orange across the walls, but it didn't chase the cold out. Not really. The warmth just made the shadows move differently. Boone paced the edge of the room, sniffing corners, ears flicking at every creak in the wood. Harlan sat by the window with the revolver across his lap, not ready to use it, just ready to hold it. He stared out into the trees and thought about the difference between wonder and warning. Sometimes they wear the same face, but not the same footprints. Outside, dusk fell fast. The sky went from steel to coal. The trees swayed, but no wind blew. Boone curled up near the stove, eyes still open. Harlan didn't light the lantern. He didn't move. He just listened. To the silence, to the air, to the space where something had stood and where it might stand again. The fog had thickened overnight. It curled low across the ground like smoke without fire, clinging to the tree trunks and creeping between roots. The air felt swollen with things unspoken, with something waiting just out of view. Harlan had barely slept. He hadn't meant to doze off, but the exhaustion had dragged him under for maybe an hour, just long enough for the fire to die down and the shadows to thicken. Now he stood at the back door, boots on, coat half-zipped, staring out into the pale gray morning. Boone paced behind him, hackles up, ears twitching like little radar dishes. The prints from yesterday were gone, washed out by dew, or maybe by time itself. But the tension hadn't left. If anything, it had taken root. There was a pressure in the woods that didn't belong, not fear exactly, but warning. He grabbed his rifle, not out of paranoia, just habit, and stepped into the morning. The fog swallowed him by the second tree. Boone followed tight, so close his fur brushed the denim of Harlan's jeans. Birds remained quiet. No squirrel chatter, no woodpecker tapping. The kind of silence that felt forced, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail he followed wasn't much more than a path worn by years of memory. He didn't use it often anymore. But today, something pulled him along it. A nudge in his gut, or maybe an itch between his ribs. The kind of feeling you don't talk about, but you trust. He moved through thickets of sword fern and brambles, ducked beneath moss-heavy limbs, and emerged near the southern bend of the river where the bank sloped wide and low. And there, plain as bone in the mud, was the proof. Tracks, fresh, not the small ones, not the ones he knew. These were wider, deeper, longer strides. The spacing was wrong, too heavy to be anything he'd seen before, too sharp to be the peaceful family that had nodded to him in gratitude. He stepped closer. The earth was torn up along the edge of the bank, gouged like something had been angry or hunting. Clumps of wet moss hung from exposed roots. Broken branches littered the edge like thrown bones. And there was a smell. Thick, metallic, sour. It hit the back of his throat and turned his stomach sideways. Boone growled, low and guttural, the kind of growl that came from something older than fear. Harlan froze. A sound rolled across the river. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't meant to be. It was low, vibrating, like a drum struck far away but echoing in his chest. A guttural growl that rose slowly, thick as tar, and settled into the space between heartbeats. The fog across the far side of the river shifted. No, moved. Shoulders. A shape. Wide. Towering. It stepped forward just enough for the shadows to catch. Its arms hung longer than a man's. Its frame was massive, built like something born for war. The fur wasn't as dark, more ash than pitch, but slicked back like it had just come out of a storm. Its chest rose and fell slowly. And then it opened its mouth, not wide, not like a roar. Just enough. The sound that came out rattled the water. Harlan stepped back, slowly. Every instinct in his body screamed not to run. Running was prey behavior, and whatever stood across that river wasn't looking for prey. It was watching him the way a wolf watches the edge of its den, not with curiosity, but with territory in its blood. Then it moved, not fast, just deliberate. It picked something up, a rock the size of a watermelon, and hurled it like it weighed nothing. It arced high and slammed into the dirt 3 feet from Harlan's boots. The impact sent wet soil spraying against his legs. Not a miss, a message. Boone barked once, sharp and cracking, but didn't lunge. Just stayed close. The creature tilted its head just slightly. Another low rumble. And then it stepped back, into the fog, and vanished. The woods fell silent again, but not empty. Harlan looked down at the cracked soil, the fresh track, the rock half buried beside him. He didn't need a translation. He'd lived too long in silence not to understand a threat when it came without words. The message was clear. You don't belong here, and it knows where your cabin is. He turned and started back. Each step deliberate, each breath deeper than the one before it. Boone stayed glued to his heel, muscles coiled. By the time they reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than usual. Fragile. Like something that could be knocked over by a gust of wind if it hit just right. He bolted the doors, lit the fire higher than necessary, checked every window twice. As the light faded, the fog rolled in again, and Harlan sat by the window, eyes locked on the tree line, the rifle across his lap again. This time it wasn't habit, it was promise. The wind didn't howl that night. It held its breath. Fog clung to the trees like old memories that didn't want to leave. The kind of fog that seeps in under the eaves and presses up against the windows like it's waiting to be let in. Harlan sat in the dark with the rifle laid across his lap, firelight licking low along the hearthstones. Boone lay stretched out near his feet, but the dog wasn't asleep. His eyes twitched with every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind. The stillness outside wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that stalks. The floorboards beneath Harlan's boots groaned softly as he stood, just enough to peer through the slit between the curtains. Nothing, just white. A wall of mist so thick he couldn't see the porch rail, though he knew it was there. He'd walked it 100 times, but tonight, the world stopped just past the glass. He lowered the curtain, Boone's ears flattened. There it was again, that feeling. Not dread. Not fear, something colder, something closer. The ground didn't shake, the trees didn't crack, but the cabin itself shifted. A low creak rolled through the timbers, not from the wind, but from weight, pressure, as if something heavy had leaned against the outer wall. Boone growled low. Then came the first thud. Not loud, not hurried, just solid, measured. Something had struck the siding. Not once, 3 times. Then nothing. Boone stood now, hackles up, nose high, frozen. Harlan stepped to the back wall, hand steady on the rifle. He didn't raise it. Not yet. He pressed his ear to the wood. Outside, something breathed. Not close, not far, just steady, big, calm. Then another sound, different, lighter, pacing, slow, circling. Footsteps. Not shoes, not paws. Heavy pads, wet, deliberate. They moved past the front window, then past the back. Then again, and again. They were circling the cabin. Harlan locked the front door again, tight. Crossbar down. He checked the windows. Curtains drawn, but he could feel them watching. Feel them just on the other side of the glass. Not a single sound of speech, no howls, no roars. just the sound of presence. Another thud against the far wall. The cabin groaned again. Boone let out a sharp bark, then whimpered. His body quivered. Not from pain, from knowing. Whatever this was, it wasn't like the others. This wasn't a visit. It was a test. Something passed the window, fast, tall, silent. Then again, he couldn't tell if it was one thing or several. His hands gripped the rifle tighter. The lantern flickered. The fire dipped. Something was sapping the air from the room. Then it hit. Not a knock, a slam. The far side of the cabin lurched inward, like a tree had fallen against it. The glass in the window cracked, just a hairline vein, but loud in the silence. Boone barked and backed into the corner, chest low to the ground. Then the sound came again, not an impact. A sound, a howl. No, deeper than that. It started low, like stone dragged across stone, and rose into a guttural moan that made the walls vibrate. Harlan felt it in his bones, not in his ears, in his rib cage. He stepped back, raised the rifle, not to fire, just to breathe. He didn't dare shoot. Not yet. He knew better than to pick a fight in the dark with something that wasn't alone. Then it passed again, right outside the door. He could hear the boards of the porch shift, just once, one footfall, then silence. He aimed and waited. He could hear Boone's breathing, short, quick. Then 3 knocks. Not from a fist, not from wood, from something much heavier. 3 dull, deliberate thuds, and then a whisper of movement, like someone backing into the trees. But not alone. From the far side of the forest, something else stirred. Another sound, lower, deeper. Not a threat, not challenge. A rhythm, a pulse. Then came the shift. Movement in the mist. Shapes. 3 figures stepped out from the fog. They didn't run. They walked. Tall, wet with dew, quiet as the moon. The same ones. The family. The child now standing steadier. The mother near his side, and the father. Massive, broad-shouldered, arms down, palms open. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The howling stopped. The pacing stopped. The pressure broke. Silence rushed back in like air after a held breath. And in that silence, Harlan understood. There were lines being drawn. Right here, right now. One between the cabin and the trees. One between whatever had stalked him tonight, and whatever had just stepped between it and him. The night didn't end. It simply held its breath. The figures stood motionless in the mist just past the clearing. No words, no movement. Just there, like sentinels cut from dark stone. Boone had gone quiet, tail tucked, crouched beside the cold hearth. Harlan didn't speak, didn't blink. His breath caught somewhere in the hollow of his chest, held like the first note before a storm. The family was back, not moving, not approaching, just there. The child stood nestled behind its mother's knee, barely peeking around her thigh, eyes wide but unafraid. The mother's arms hung loose, but the weight in her stance was unmistakable. And the father, he was closer now than before. Closer than any of them had ever dared. His chest rose and fell like slow thunder. One step forward, and the distance between wild and home would be gone. Then came the growl, from deep in the trees. Far left of the clearing, lower, meaner. The fog rolled again, splitting slightly as something larger moved through it. It didn't step out. It didn't need to. The sound was enough. The male Bigfoot turned his head, just slightly. He knew. They all did. Something was coming. The ground vibrated again, not with steps, but with weight shifting in the dark. Branches creaked. Not snapped. Strained, like they were being tested by a shoulder, by force. Another growl. This one closer. Lower. It curved around the cabin like it had a memory to finish. The father moved. Just one step. Then the mother stepped forward. The child at her side now, her arm lowering slightly like an old shield being drawn. They stood in front of the cabin. Not beside it, not behind it, in front of it. Harlan blinked slowly. He realized something that didn't make sense and yet made all the sense in the world. They weren't here to flee. They were here to block, to protect, from the same thing that had slammed the wall last night, from the presence that circled in the dark, from the thing that had watched and waited and tested. Then, through the fog, it came, massive, hunched, its outline not fully seen, but enough to understand it didn't walk like the others. It didn't hold itself upright. Its gait was wrong, angry, animalistic, and its shoulders, wide enough to blot the trees behind it. The breath it released was loud, wheezing, almost wet. Every step it took made the dirt vibrate, and it didn't stop. It came forward, slow but sure, eyes burning low through the fog, breath pumping from flared nostrils. The kind of thing that didn't warn. It announced. Harlan gripped the rifle tighter, but the father raised a hand, not to Harlan, to the thing. A sound filled the clearing, low, clipped, rhythmic, almost like speech, but buried in another language. It wasn't just guttural. It had shape, weight, and the air shifted with it. The fog seemed to pause around them. The beast slowed. The father stepped forward again, now fully between the cabin and the threat. His arms hung at his sides, but his fingers curled, spread, curled again, measured, steady. Then the other one answered. A howl, broken at the edges. No form, no language, just fury. The child stepped backward, nestling again behind the mother's leg. The father didn't move. The thing advanced. And the second it crossed the line between the trees and clearing, he struck. Not with fists, with presence. The father surged forward, not fast, not lunging, just massive, deliberate, commanding. The ground shook with his motion. His chest opened, and the sound he released wasn't roar. It was decree, a deep, bone-twisting sound that split the mist like wind through canvas. The intruder halted, snorted, lowered its stance. Harlan could feel the tension between them like two magnets pushing against each other, invisible but violent. Neither touched, but the energy pressed in from all sides. Then came a second sound, from behind the trees. Another presence, a third, and then nothing. Silence. The larger creature didn't retreat immediately. It stood a moment longer, jaw clenched, breath heaving, shoulders twitching like it fought its own blood. Then it turned, not with fear, but with warning, and disappeared into the dark. The trees absorbed it whole. The father exhaled, a long, low breath that filled the space like a dying engine. And for a moment, everything stopped. The mother turned. The child looked up at her. She placed her hand gently on its shoulder, and then they looked back, at Harlan. The rifle still hung useless in his arms. They had done what he could not. They had made something leave. Not by force, by unity. And then the father turned to Harlan one last time. No nod, no grand gesture, just a look. A look that said, you stood with us. You were not prey. You were part of the circle now. And without another sound, they disappeared into the fog again. Harlan didn't move for a long time. The forest resumed eventually, slowly. The wind breathed again. A bird called in the distance. The fire inside the cabin had gone low, but he didn't need it to feel warm. The walls hadn't saved him tonight. The woods had, and the ones who walked them. The morning after wasn't quiet. It was still. Not the same as silence. Stillness had weight. It hung in the rafters and floated over the fire pit, wrapped around the cabin like fog that hadn't yet decided whether to lift. Harlan stood at the back door, mug in hand, steam curling toward his face but never quite reaching. His breath had steadied. His hands had stopped shaking, but something inside him hadn't sat back down yet. Something was still on its feet, watching, listening, waiting to make sense of what the hell had happened under the trees last night. The edge of the cabin wall still bore the mark. A long bowed indent in the siding, wood bent, but not broken. He could have patched it, had the tools, had the time, but he didn't. Not yet. He ran his fingers over the groove like it meant something. Boone sniffed it earlier that morning, gave a low whimper, and didn't go near it again. Inside, the air still smelled like burnt cedar and metal. Leftover fear. But it wasn't choking anymore, the kind of fear that turns into memory once you survive it. He took the mug outside. Not far, just to the edge of the porch. The trees looked normal again. Too normal, as if they'd shut their mouths and wiped the blood from their teeth. Harlan watched them, knowing what he'd seen, what had stood between him and the thing that circled, that prowled, that tested the walls like a man pressing his thumb into a bruise just to see how deep the pain went. But it hadn't gotten in, because someone else had stood there first. Bigger than him, stronger, quieter. He sat on the porch step, not thinking, not planning, just letting the world settle back around him. It was Boone who moved first. The dog stood at the edge of the porch, nose in the wind, ears pricked. Not afraid, not wagging, just alert, watching something Harlan couldn't see yet. Then he saw it, a movement, not fast, just enough. At the tree line, maybe 20 yards out, the forest darkened slightly. A small figure stepped into the clearing. The child, smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it had just seemed taller in the fog. It walked slowly, not creeping, just careful. Its arms hung low. Its fur was darker now, wet from dew or river mist. And in one hand, it carried something. It stopped near the edge of the clearing, looked up. Harlan didn't move, didn't stand, just watched. The child crouched, placed the bundle at the base of a cedar stump. Something wrapped in leaves. It adjusted it with both hands, then stood again. One glance toward the cabin, and then it turned and disappeared. No sound, no snap, no goodbye. Harlan waited. Then he stood, crossed the yard slow, his boots sinking slightly into the damp moss. When he reached the stump, he knelt. The bundle was simple, just leaves, moss, twine that looked like it had been chewed from roots. But inside, 3 ears of corn, dry, whole, and 2 strips of smoked fish tied with cedar thread. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just looked at it, felt it. His hands shook, not from cold. He stood, took nothing with him, left it there. That night he built a second fire just outside the cabin. Not big, just enough. The light glowed soft against the trees, and he made an offering. Not a tribute, not payment, just an answer. He set out 3 things. A tin cup with warm water and pine ash, a folded wool cloth from Evelyn's sewing box, and a single cedar bough, fresh. He didn't stay out long, just long enough. Long enough to say it back. The next morning the cloth was gone. The cup had been tipped, cleaned out, placed upside down like a sign of completion. And the cedar bough, it had been moved, bent into a perfect loop and left on the porch step. Boone sniffed it once, then sat beside it. Didn't bark, didn't wag, just sat. Harlan watched him, watched the trees, watched the wind shift through the canopy like fingers brushing the back of his neck. There were no more sounds in the night after that. No howls, no steps circling the cabin, just owls. And sometimes a shadow, not a threat, a presence. Harlan went about his days different after that. Still checked traps, but didn't set them near the river. Still cleaned his rifle, but didn't carry it at dusk. Still kept the cabin locked, but not every night. Sometimes he left the door open, sometimes just the window, and always, every 3rd morning, he left something by the stump. Fish, bread, a bit of flannel, a length of twine. Sometimes it was taken, sometimes not. But it wasn't about trade anymore. It was about rhythm, like breathing, like trust. And once, when the clouds were low and the rain came straight down in sheets, Harlan stood just under the eave of the porch and saw something on the ridge. A figure, broad, still, watching him, not hiding. Just there. They looked at each other, and then the figure raised one arm, not high, just to its chest, a hand placed over the heart. Harlan did the same, and it turned, and left. The trees closed behind it, like nothing had happened. But everything had. The first chill arrived in the hush before dawn. No thunder of weather fronts, just a single honest shiver sliding through the cedar grove and brushing the cabin door like a polite reminder that nothing stands still for long. By the time pale light seeped in under the eaves, the vine maples down by the river already carried freckles of orange. A few brittle alder leaves skittered across the roof. tapped the tin like distant footsteps, then tumbled into the grass where Boone sniffed them with vague suspicion and decided they weren't worth barking at. Inside, the fire had shrunk to whispers. Harlan nudged the embers with a blackened poker, feeling the sleepy pulse of heat bloom against his knuckles. He eased a fresh log onto the coals, watched resin hiss, thought about how the sound almost matched the low steam of a kettle from the long-gone kitchen of his old life. Memory didn't hurt as sharply these days. It nudged rather than pierced, left room for other feelings to live alongside it. He poured water into the dented enamel pot, set it on the grate, and listened to the river outside. Not roaring now, but talking the way worn friends do when they no longer need to fill the silence. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Breath clouded the air in a thin veil. The sun lay low behind the ridgeline, painting the mist over the water a faint copper. Grass glistened with dew, each blade a tiny mirror catching the sky. He tugged his flannel tighter, rubbed the fatigue from his eyes, and looked toward the cedar stump at the edge of the clearing. Still there, right where he'd left it. A small parcel wrapped in fern fronds, his latest offering. Smoked salmon folded with care, 2 lengths of rawhide twine, a single shiny nickel he'd found in the cabin rafters. Nothing had moved overnight. That was fine. Sometimes gifts waited, sometimes they vanished before nightfall, sometimes they were left untouched until rain shredded them back into earth. The ritual mattered more than the result. Boone padded out behind him, tail sweeping lazy arcs. The dog's muzzle had grayed over summer, but his eyes were bright, fixed on the tree line like he expected the forest itself might step forward for roll call. Harlan ruffled the thick fur between Boone's ears, then followed the well-trodden path toward the river bluff, boots squelching softly in damp loam. He carried no rifle, no rope, just a tin cup filled with warm water and a pinch of pine ash swirling at the bottom. An old ranger remedy for grounding, for gratitude, for making peace with places that do not speak your language. At the bluff's edge, he paused. The hoe had settled since spring's fury, its surface a dark braid of glass and shadow sliding over gray stones. A skim of morning fog still clung to bends where water curved around sandbars. Sunlight sliced through the vapor in trembling shafts that made the whole valley look, if only for a breath, like a cathedral roofed by clouds. He tipped the cup, letting the ash-flecked water drift onto a patch of moss growing along a splintered rail. Steam rose, brief and faint, then dissolved. He remembered the river filled with ice knives and thunder, the scramble of long limbs in the current, the rope burning his palms raw. He remembered the quiet nod that followed, and the darker figure that tried to tear that nod away. Those memories felt older than the calendar suggested, carved deep, polished by retelling only in his own head. No one else needed to hear them. The woods had already recorded the truth. From up valley a breeze traveled down, lifted dry cedar needles into a soft rattle, carried the earthy scent of distant rain that might or might not arrive by dusk. The breeze brushed the hair at his temples, and in that passing hush he heard it again. 3 hollow taps rolling through the trunks like knuckles on an unseen door. Not loud, not urgent, simply present. He closed his eyes, let the sound settle under his ribs like a second heartbeat, and murmured a barely spoken thank you to no one in particular. He turned back toward the cabin, following the trail lined with early mushrooms pushing through leaf litter and stone. Somewhere overhead, a Steller's jay let out its startled rasp, but no predator followed. Autumn had its own schedule, and even hungry things seemed to move in slower rhythms now. Boone trotted ahead, nose down, then stopped, ears lifting. Harlan's gaze followed the dog's attention to the stump. The fern parcel was gone, not torn, not scattered, simply absent, lifted clean away. In its place sat a river rock, smooth as honed soapstone, dusk gray with a single bright vein of quartz curling across the surface like frozen lightning. He bent, brushed a thumb over the streak. The stone was warm, despite the chill. He slipped it into his breast pocket, feeling its weight settle close to his heart. Then he carried 4 damp cedar logs to the porch, split 2 for kindling, stacked the rest under the overhang. Each motion felt calmer than the last, as though repetition itself stitched new skin over old wounds. By afternoon, a fine drizzle drifted in, turning the yard to pearls of water balanced on spider silk. Harlan brewed chicory coffee, sliced a heel of cornbread, shared half with Boone. They ate by the fire, watching embers swirl up the flue like transient stars. Outside, rain ticked on the roof, steady but gentle, another reminder that cycles continue whether or not you mark them on paper. Night settled early. He stepped onto the porch once more, lantern raised just enough to brush the clearing with amber light. Rain had quieted to mist. Clouds broke, revealing a sliver of moon hung like a silver clasp above black fur silhouettes. He took the stone from his pocket, set it on the railing, and beside it laid a single short candle, unlit. A silent promise that light would always be offered, never demanded. He backed away, closed the door, and banked the fire low. Boone curled on the rug, sighing into sleep. In the dark, Harlan lay on the cot, listening. The river's murmur seeped through log walls. Between breaths, he caught the faintest shift of boards on the porch. No crunch, no scrape, just pressure easing onto wood. Then the soft thunk of something small being lifted. A pause. 3 measured knocks on the railing. 1, 2, 3. Boone lifted his head but did not bark. He watched the door, ears forward, tail thumping once in acknowledgement, then laid back down. Harlan's eyes stung, not with fear, not with sorrow, but with a quiet ache born of understanding. He held it the way one holds the final note of a song, letting it vibrate to silence rather than cutting it short. Outside, the boards lightened, freed of weight. Rain steadied to a hush. The candle was gone. The quartz stone remained. And carved beside it, lightly with care, 3 small grooves, each the width of a fingertip. Morning arrived with a sky washed clean. Golden sun stretched across the river, igniting mist into strands of fire. Harlan opened the door, picked up the stone, traced the grooves. He pressed his palm flat over them, then set the stone on the windowsill where Dawn could find it every day. He brewed coffee, fed Boone, swept the porch. Normal tasks, ordinary moments, but each one carried a note of ceremony unnoticed by passers-by who would never come. He had no need to travel beyond the valley. Supplies lasted longer than they used to. Appetite shrank to match slower days. Sometimes memory of his daughter surfaced, a sound, a trick of light, and instead of drowning in it, he breathed through it. Grief had not left. It had taken a different seat at the table, content to listen rather than speak. Through October, the exchanges continued. Corn for polished stones, dried berries for intricately knotted grass cords. A folded blue bandana returned months after blowing off his clothesline, now braided with cedar fibers as if fixed by unseen hands. Each arrival and departure felt less like trade and more like dialogue. Simple, profound, sturdy as the river's own grammar. Late in the month, frost rhymed the ground at dawn. Harlan pulled on his thick wool coat, stepped outside, and nearly laughed at the shock of cold in his lungs. He followed the trail to the bluff for the 1,000th time, mug steaming in his grasp. Downstream, through a veil of lifted fog, he spotted silhouettes. Tall, slow, walking the gravel bar where spring howls once raged. They did not look up. They did not need to. Presence alone addressed him. He raised his cup in greeting. The tallest paused, turned halfway, and placed a hand over its chest in the same silent salute he'd returned once before. Then the figures slipped into cedar shadows, quiet as falling dust. On the walk back, a single question circled his mind but never found words. What now? The answer came like breath. Keep living. He stacked fresh wood, mended a cracked window pane, rubbed linseed oil into the porch rail carved with 3 grooves. Evening found him reading by lamplight, an old geology field guide, pages yellow, margins doodled by a girl's small hand decades gone. He smiled at the memory, whispered goodnight to the empty room, and closed the book with care. Before sleep, he wrote 3 lines in the ragged journal he'd ignored for years. The river keeps its secrets. Kindness does too. Listen long enough, and both will speak. He set the journal aside, doused the lantern, and let darkness fold around him like a quilt stitched by everything he'd come to trust. River, dog, forest, unseen allies who walked on soft feet and spoke with knocks. Outside, wind quickened, rattled last leaves from branches, scattered them across the clearing in a hush that sounded almost like farewell. Yet nothing felt like an ending. It felt instead like a breath drawn deep before the next verse of a song that never truly stops. Inside the cabin, firelight pulsed against log walls. Boone dreamed, paws twitching in some private chase. Harlan's eyes drifted closed with the same steady rhythm as the water beyond the hill. A current that never ceased. A lullaby for anyone brave or lucky enough to listen. And far off, where moonlight met timber and the human world surrendered to myth, 3 gentle knocks answered the river's song, echoing once more through the valley, promising the story would carry on. In silence, in respect, in the living warmth between one open hand and another outstretched to meet it. There are stories we tell to remember, and then there are the quiet ones, meant not to be remembered, but felt. This was one of those stories. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts aren't loud. They don't come wrapped in glory or attention. They come quietly, in the form of a hand reaching through cold water, a gesture left in moss, a moment of stillness shared between 2 hearts that don't speak the same language, but understand one another just the same. In a world that moves too fast, that shouts to be heard, that forgets the soft things, this was a whisper about mercy, about the weight of compassion, about how the smallest choices, to protect, to pause, to trust, can change the current of a life. Even the coldest rivers remember warmth. Even the most wounded hearts can leave space for something sacred to return. And perhaps that's what the wilderness has been trying to teach us all along. That you don't have to conquer something to belong to it. That love doesn't always look like what we expect. That the line between us and what we fear is often drawn in misunderstanding and can just as easily be erased by one act of grace. The truth is, some bonds defy reason. Some connections don't need names or explanations. Only silence, only trust, only the understanding that when we care for something, truly care, it has a way of remembering us too. And in that remembering, something lost can be found again. Not in the way it was before, but in a way that heals, in a way that holds, in a way that lasts. Thank you for listening. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the quiet weight of it, I'd love to know. Drop a comment. Let me know what part stayed with you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing more stories like this. Stories that remind us we're not alone, even in the deepest woods. Take care of each other out there, and when the river speaks, listen.